Hey there. Welcome to the First Look. Thank you for being here today as we continue moving down the line into Advent. And today, not only am I definitely inside because it's gross, but I have espresso, and that makes me, I think, feel a little bit more classy or something. So I won't live into that, but I like the idea of it at least. So this week is I like any passage that has to do with this particular person because this is John the Baptist. Because I think that he's one of those people that we give appropriate homage to, but at the same time, I feel like completely undersell. Because we have so much of our identity, I think, that we owe to him. And I think that we also undersell his influence in the world and context in which he lived. And it makes sense that we do that because we start talking about Jesus, and everyone pales in comparison to Jesus. But if you, for a moment, allow yourself to just sort of focus your gaze on John, then what I think you see there is pretty miraculous. So before I keep going, I am going to tell you the passage that we'll be looking at. So the text for this week is Luke 3, verse 7 through 16. And since I'm sitting down and I have it in front of me, I really have no excuse to do that whole pause thing. I can just read it to you while I sip my pretentious coffee. All right, here we go. John said to the crowds that came out to be baptized by him, "You brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the wrath to come? Bear fruits worthy of repentance. Do not begin to say to yourselves, 'We have Abraham as our ancestor.' For I tell you, God is able from these stones to raise up children to Abraham. Even now the axe is lying at the root of the trees. Every tree, therefore, that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire." We'll come back to that, but there isn't any other way of looking at that other than huge, big scorn and basically like swearing. This is a big, bold, bordering on just this is as high as fire and brimstone, I think, as it gets. Moving forward. And the crowds asked him, "What then should we do?" In reply, he said to them, "Whoever has 2 coats must share with anyone who has none, and whoever has food must do likewise." Even tax collectors came to be baptized, and they asked him, "Teacher, what should we do?" And he said to them, "Collect no more than the amount prescribed to you." Soldiers also asked him, "And we, what should we do?" And he said to them, "Do not extort money from anyone by threats or false accusation, and be satisfied with your wages." As the people were filled with expectation and all were questioning in their hearts concerning John whether he might be the Messiah, John answered all of them by saying, "I baptize you with water, but one who is more powerful than I is coming. I am not worthy to untie the thong of his sandals. He will baptize you with the Holy Spirit and with fire." So this past week, we talked about Ruth. And I was trying to make a connection between Ruth's story and the stories that Jesus tells. And the way I did it was by talking about Orpah. Orpah the one that goes off and doesn't follow Naomi, doesn't go with Ruth, goes back to her people. And I was sort of comparing and contrasting her story with the prodigal story, the story of the prodigal son, and trying to kind of look at that a little bit differently, to look at both of them side by side, even though there are many differences and many similarities, looking at them with the hope of trying to figure out, well, who do we see Jesus to be? What does he talk about? What stories does he share? What parables does he share? What might inspire him, right? And so you start to look at, those stories of old, and you look at this one, this particular story of Jesus, or John the Baptist preparing the way. And obviously this particular story takes place when Jesus is an adult. So this isn't a story that Mary would tell Jesus, obviously. But what you would get from this story, or you could get from this story, is when it happens, you could get Mary talking to Jesus about how the two of them were born. It's a natural callback, I think, to the beginning story of the angel visiting Mary and her going to visit Elizabeth while she's pregnant, and them kind of talking back and forth about the children they were about to have and what that would be like. And then how John kind of fulfills his role as the one who proclaims, the one who looks forward, the one who opens the door, but does so in a completely different way than his parents would have assumed. Everything about John is following the path that was always before him. Everything about him is following the path that I think his parents, especially his father, would have assumed, but with none of the form and function. Because if you remember, John's father was a priest, and which means he followed every order, right? He learned everything he needed to. He excelled. He became a priest because he absorbed the information. He was just naturally good at it. He obviously, you wouldn't become a priest at that time if you didn't show a great aptitude for that role. And John clearly went a completely different way. And so in that way, I'm sure for a long time, was probably seen as this kind of a potential failure, or a potential black sheep, or a potential kind of rebel in his own family. And then he emerges from that experience and becomes this tremendously charismatic leader who redefines forgiveness, who redefines our path to salvation, and then looks forward. Sort of becomes this figure that takes on the mantle of a person like Isaiah, so much so that people start to think that he's the Messiah, which you listen to the way he talks, you can completely see how that could happen. And then so you get to this part after all this sort of rebellion and taking on this role in the community and redefining the things that he does. And when I say redefining, I mean that throughout these conversations that John has with these different people who come to be baptized, the tax collector, the soldier, the followers, he says, you and people like you have done things this way. Now you need reform. You and people like you have done this way. Now you need reform. So there's a social reform that's happening. You can imagine some person who works in the federal government, or some person who works in law enforcement or in the military, coming to John the Baptist and saying, what is it that I need to do? And he says, you need to reform the way that you work in this system. And thus, the system itself needs to be reformed because it's not working. So it's not just an individual coming to faith, but he recognizes that the systems that the people exist in are broken, and they need healing. And so there's that kind of element to it, which would give you a sense that he could be the Messiah, because Messiahs look at not just the individual person, but they look at systems. They look at the whole, right? The big picture. They want to redeem Israel. But then, of course, in the middle of that, there's also this very individual kind of need for people to be redeemed of their own sin. He talks about like chopping down the tree and you brood of vipers, and like the way that they're coming to him. Like, hey, you're not just coming for some kind of like salvation for a gift here. This is about changing who you are, change of self. And so he looks at that from like a community basis and an individual basis, systems basis. And so we see in John this person who is realizing that top down things are not the way that they should be, which is much like Isaiah. Isaiah lived at a time when he had to address the individual sin, or the way that people had gone astray, but also how the kingdom had gone astray, right? Israel was being taken into exile, not because of what one person did, but because of this collective ignorance towards how to be faithful to God. The book of Isaiah starts with this critique on not their worship, but on their service to the poor. How they have ignored, the widow, the orphan, the stranger. That both individually and socially, the structure had broken down, which is why this exile was allowed to happen. And then speaks to the redemption of all that. And John the Baptist kind of takes on that same idea. And then from there, kind of sets the stage for what we will see Jesus up to. So much of what Jesus does, of course, is approaches the people with this inclusivity and kindness and thoughtfulness and gentleness. The way he heals people, the way he approaches and allows children to approach him, the way he feeds people and cares for people, all the things we see Jesus do. But he also, of course, has heavy critique for the people. He flips over tables at the temple, and he curses the fig tree, and he goes into his hometown of Nazareth, and he reads from Isaiah, and then basically says, I'm fulfilling this scripture, and people applaud. And then he says, but not for you, because Israel is a mess. And they almost drive him off the cliff, if you remember that story. Jesus did a lot of the same things that we see John the Baptist doing? And it uses a similar language, and I'll go back to, I think, some of the language that is has the most kind of overlap. Let's see. Every tree, therefore, that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. John says that. We hear Jesus say something very, very similar. And I think that's the part that gets lost. If we talk about the influence of Jesus, what influences him, and that's kind of what we talked about last week and the week before, was looking at the way, Mary and Joseph and his childhood and the stories he would have been told. You imagine must have some kind of influence on who he is as a person. But that continues in adulthood. When the mantle is passed to Jesus, when it comes to whose kingdom this will be and how it will get created, especially after John's death, you see Jesus kind of emulating a lot of what John did. People were drawn to John, and John, of course, wasn't capable of the same things that Jesus is capable of. From a miracle standpoint, I think even from a parabolic standpoint, we see Jesus using parables, and that's not really. I think John's a little bit more straightforward. He wants a result in your life. He wants to tell you something explicitly. He wants you to act. Come and be baptized. Go and do this. Jesus spends a lot more time, and maybe just has more time for teaching and sermon and contemplative kinds of acts. John is not depicted that way. Maybe he was that way. He certainly must have been in his early years, as he emerges from the wilderness. You imagine he spent a lot of time by himself. He spent a lot of time in solitude or in small group or, not in the public eye. And, his worldview is affected and cultivated in those places. And so you can start to see some of that in the way that he, leads the people. And I think Jesus takes a lot of that on as he continues the ministry. John, I think, on kind of this personal note, I think if we know anything about him, it's that I think he would have been considered extraordinarily dangerous by almost everyone. I think that's the thing that we miss. I think that every single person who was confronted with John the Baptist would have seen him as dangerous. Even the people who loved him, even the people who cared for him, even the people who followed him. I think there came so much unrest, so little convention, that I think it scared everyone. Either was so exciting and revolutionary that you got swept up in it, or it scared the bejesus out of you, and you were like, which is why he ends up beheaded. But he knows the scriptures and he knows, he understands the faith, but he wasn't schooled in any kind of predictable way. He kind of emerges as this wild card. And then he very firmly attacks the structures that are well put in place. Because, if you hear him talking in this passage, he talks to soldiers and he talks to tax collectors and he talks to the people, and he's calling for reform. Well, I'm sure there were people who were like, yeah, I should live differently, and other people who took that as a real threat. And so when we get to the end of his earthly story, and you get to a place where you realize, there were people in high places who didn't like John the Baptist. It's easy to see why. Because he, one, was knocking at the door of the powers that be, but was claiming to speak for God at a time when there had not been a prophet, a kind of confirmed prophet of God for a very long time. And Israel had seen, they'd watched the land over hundreds of years just become more and more entrenched in the Roman Empire, but also just the people of Israel become more and more used to being subject to this power. And then, you get someone like John the Baptist that just blows the doors off, and all of that would have been, there would have been this threat. And you wonder, if things would have been different, if Herod would have known, or there would have been some prophecy about John the Baptist along with, the Messiah, with, him hunting down Jesus and the wise men leaving and all that. In some ways, John the Baptist becomes as much or more of a threat, at least initially, than Jesus did. Because Jesus ultimately isn't trying to, or doesn't endeavor to do what the disciples thought he was going to do, which was, take out the empire and restructure the government and do all that. He wants a kingdom of people's hearts. You start to wonder, what John the Baptist would have done if he would have stayed alive. If how that would have worked out. And maybe there was no other way of it working out other than the way that it did, but you do wonder, would at some point John the Baptist have completely gone into the backdrop? Would he have kept pushing Jesus forward to do more? I don't know. I never really thought about what happens if John the Baptist stays alive. That's mostly a thought experiment, but I don't know, give it some thought. What do you think happens? Does he just become one of the disciples? Does he just, is it become the 13 instead of the 12? Who knows? But anyway, I never really thought about that. So I think the sermon title is something like, "Do the good you have to do." It's something like that, and it's about the idea is about whatever you are able to accomplish, which is going to be different than what somebody else can accomplish. Then you need to be about that good work. John was not going to be the Messiah. He was not chosen to be the Messiah. He was not born to be the Messiah. He was born to do what he was doing, which is point the way, open the door, clear the path, which is what he did. And so each of us have this kind of role to play in how we live out our vocation as followers. So this week, as you're thinking about that, just think about your own role, how you play it, how you've chosen to play it, or what you could choose moving forward, which could be different than what you've done in the past. So that's what we're calling you here to think about for this week. Okay. Thank you for doing this. Thank you for thinking through this story. Thanks for, taking time in Advent to reassess and reflect. I hope you have a wonderful week, and I will see you next time for another First Look. So until then, take care.